Kontext 21.
Ergänzungswirtschaftsraum über die neokoloniale Aufteilung des Balkans am Beispiel Montenegros. Eine Sendung der Ökologischen Linken Wien.
Montenegro ist als Rest mittelalterlicher serbischer Reiche nach dem Sieg der Osmanen in der Schlacht am Amselfeld entstanden. Einige slawische Bergstämme widersetzten sich der Expansion der Osmanen und bildeten in den Schwarzen Bergen eine unabhängige Theokratie, die als Königreich bis 1918 unabhängig blieb. Nach der Eingliederung in das Königreich Jugoslawiens in der Folge des Ersten Weltkrieges erlebte Montenegro als Teil Jugoslawiens die Geschichte der innenpolitischen Auseinandersetzungen des jungen Staates mit, so auch die deutsche Besatzung und den Partisanenkampf gegen die nationalsozialistische Terrorherrschaft. Als eigene Teilrepublik im neuen sozialistischen Jugoslawien wurde der Republik neue Gebiete eingegliedert. In der kleinsten Republik der Föderation kam es nach dem Tode Titos im Gegensatz zu Kroatien und Serbien kaum zu einem Wiederaufflammen des Nationalismus. So blieb Montenegro bis heute Teil des Gesamtstaates, der 2002 in Serbien-Montenegro umbenannt wurde und eine vorläufige föderalistische Verfassung erhielt. Vertreterinnen und Vertreter einer vollständigen Unabhängigkeit geht diese Lösung jedoch nicht weit genug. Im Juni 2002 hielt Alex Dajkovic aus Montenegro auf Einladung der Ökologischen Linken im Ernst-Kirchweger-Haus in Wien einen Vortrag über die politische und wirtschaftliche Situation in der kleineren der beiden Teilrepubliken des nunmehr Serbien-Montenegro genannten ehemaligen Jugoslawien. Dabei ging es auch um die neokoloniale Aufteilung des Balkans durch Deutschland und die USA.
Thank you for coming to listen to a talk about Montenegro, because Montenegro is very small. It has only about 650,000 people, and the area is also very small, on the size of some larger world cities. But the reason why I think it's interesting is because it provides an example of what has been going on in the Balkans over the last 10-20 years. And because it's because it's so small and vulnerable, in many cases it shows the principles that are operating in Balkan politics with considerable clarity. So I think that's one of the reasons why I talk about it, and I also know a lot about it, so I can give you a lot of examples. Several main points that I want to drive home today, and in general when I talk about these things, are that throughout Balkan history there have been certain patterns in history that have repeated themselves over and over. The persistent patterns are that the Balkans have served as basically as service zones for the more developed centers of economic and power centers. It's interesting that we're in Vienna, because Vienna was really the capital of most of of a large part of what used to be Yugoslavia. That was part of a bigger empire. As a consequence, people of the region didn't have much decision-making in their political and social lives, because the decisions were made elsewhere in other centers of power. And another persistent feature is that there has been nationalism in the region. I would argue that a large portion of that is precisely due to this outside interference, which has manipulated the internal elements, and of course the politicians who are always pulling the strings. The easiest way to manipulate the people is through some emotional reaction, such as nationalism. And it's also interesting to contrast that with the most successful period in Balkan history in terms of economics and coexistence and so forth. And it was most anti-nationalistic, and that was period after World War II. So Montenegro is often hailed as an example, as a model for the entire Balkans by many policy officials, especially from the United States. So when Montenegrin president visits Washington or something like that, they always say how he comes from a country that's a guiding light for the region, and the economic reforms that Montenegro is implementing should be an example for other countries in the region, and efforts of democratization we'll talk about. If we look at what that actually means and what is actually going on, I think I'll give you some examples for my three main arguments, that nothing has really changed, and we're in Balkan politics, we're actually reverting to period before World War II, and to history as it was for centuries before that. So a little bit of the background. When Yugoslavia fell apart, Montenegrin official policy was to stay committed to Yugoslavian Federation, and in fact the ruling party in Montenegro that inherited was from the Communist Party, remained the ruling party, was committed to Milosevic, and that was all the way up until 1997. And there was a crisis in the ruling party and a split, at which point the United States came in and promised Djukanovic, who was the leader of the pro-Western faction, support, and he won the subsequent elections with very slim margins. And so why did the United States do this? It's really a very simple geostrategical device that the United States uses, or not just the United States, any country that has real power and geostrategic ambitions, Germany included, and Austria played also a very important role in the disintegration of Yugoslavia. But it's called co-optation. If you read geostrategic literature, that's a very important method of getting your way in a given region. So basically what you do is you take an internal political situation and you find the players that will benefit your policy the most, and you support them financially, politically, and so on. And that's exactly what happened. So after that time, Montenegro became committed to implementing certain policies for economic restructuring, and this and also social and democratic transitions. But I want to focus on the economic aspect, because that's really maybe it's my bias, but I think that that's really one of the most significant aspects of what's going on in the Balkans. And it's not going on just in Montenegro, it's going on in Croatia, in Serbia, now in Macedonia. Bosnia is a very vulnerable example, in Kosovo and so on. And what's basically happening is that technical assistance is provided by, for example, the United States. And technical assistance means that people from the United States government sends teams that write laws and policies for the Montenegrin government. And of course there's an incredible amount of pressure to implement these policies at the level of the government and in the parliament. So, as you can imagine, the policies that are written this way and given are only secondarily benefit Montenegro. They're designed to advance geostrategic interests of the United States. I mean, the United States is a global power, and it has interests in the region, and it's advancing them in a variety of ways. And these methods are sent, these technical assistance teams are sent through U.S. Agency for International Development, which is not an independent organization. It's under the control of the State Department, and it basically implements U.S. foreign policy through developmental aid and so on. And these U.S. aid has been writing several laws, and has a major project in Montenegro, one of the biggest ones in the Balkans, in fact. And I've talked to those people. It's very interesting to talk to them. And one of the first things that they did was rewrite the law on foreign investment. And Montenegro had an older law on foreign investment, which was a little bit protective of the national resources. You couldn't sell everything to foreign investors and so on. The law that was written by U.S. aid was structured totally differently, and the whole point was to totally open up Montenegro to foreign investment. Now, one argument that you could give for that is that Montenegro actually needs foreign investment, right, to develop. But I've talked to many Montenegrin economists, and in fact looked at the figures. There's no shortage of capital in Montenegro at all. There's a lot of capital that's sitting around and it's not being mobilized for a variety of reasons, but the lack of capital is not one of them. And one of the main arguments that you could give to have foreign investors come and buy Montenegrin enterprises is that there's a lack of capital to mobilize the economy. So that's not the reason. But what can you expect from opening up Montenegro, which is now being devastated for about 10 years of sanctions and total economic collapse? There's one detail that I tell people it's very interesting. In 2001, GDP, gross domestic product, it's an indicator of the strength of an economy in Montenegro and Serbia was 73% lower than in 1989. So in 10 years after 1989, Montenegro and Serbia have regressed economically by 3/4. So in other words, the buying power and everything in Montenegro has fallen incredibly. And when you open up the economy like that, the only consequence is that the only profitable enterprises, and there are a few in Montenegro, will be bought up by foreign investors. And what that means with this new law that was written by USAID is that basically Montenegrin economy is going to be controlled by foreign firms and foreign companies, and the profits that they make in Montenegro will not stay there and being reinvested to promote Montenegrin economy, but will be taken to the safety of the Western countries and Western banks. was one of the most profitable Montenegro enterprises is a beer factory. And it was bought by Interbrew, which is a Belgian beer chain, and they have factories all over the place. And there have been problems because people there have demanded, because the factory has functioned profitably, they have demanded salary increases over time. Their salaries are higher than the Montenegrin average, but the Montenegrin average salary is 100 euros per month. So you can imagine how people can live. And there's also one thing to say also about the prices. Because of the influence of US aid and policy changes, foreign trade has also been liberalized. So there's actually no manufacturing in Montenegro going on. All the goods that come into Montenegro come from either Western Europe or other countries in the region. So the prices that you pay for food and most other articles of common consumption are a little different than, or just slightly lower than, for example, in Austria or in Slovenia, where the average salary is 100 euros per month. The average salary in this beer factory is about, I think, 300 euros per month, and they dared strike to demand higher wages, and now for over a month the factory has been closed because they can't reach an agreement with the management. But that's sort of a scenario. That's sort of a typical scenario that's now developing, not just in Montenegro, but all over Eastern Europe, really, but the countries that were former Yugoslavia. But when you were there, did you think that the prices were reasonably high? I mean, you weren't surprised by how low the prices were?
No, they were not.
I mean, it was comparable to...
In a restaurant, something like that, or in a store, it was just comparably...
Yeah, like in Austria. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine what people's standard of living is if the prices are approximately like in Austria, and an average monthly salary is 100 euros per month. There's another aspect of economic policy that has been changed under the influence of US aid and other advisors to the Montenegrin government. That's monetary policy. Euro was, or the German mark was introduced as official currency in Montenegro. So what does that actually mean? That means that Montenegro has a stable currency in a sense. But now it's been almost 3 years, more than 3 years, 3.5 years since the German mark or the euro was introduced, and the inflation has been persistently high. So the inflation was 26, 27, 28%, 25%, depending on the year. So the only reason that was given to have the euro or the German mark is not sustained. In other words, now we have euro, but inflation is still very high compared to European countries. And what this means is that, but inflation is high on goods of mass consumption. It's actually higher for goods than 26% for goods of food and articles that people need every day. But the prices of, for example, real estate and of course, factories and Montenegrin enterprises have stayed very low. So even this inflation that's going on now has an asymmetric effect. It affects the people in the country very much because the prices are going up, but the foreign investors that come, the only ones that can afford to buy large portions of real estate or factories or so on, are unaffected. And another consequence of change of this monetary policy is that Montenegro now has no independence in monetary policy. It can't control emissions of its money. So when Montenegrin banks need advances from the central bank, there is no such thing. They have to loan money from European banks, very often very unfavorable rates, and so on. And this is just another example of what I was saying, that transfer of decision making, as it's happening over the last 10 years, is happening from the local level to the level of global centers of power, like in this case Europe. There's another example that I want to give you from the economy, and that is one of the largest Montenegrin enterprises, and that's the aluminum manufacturing plant. It was given for management in a very complicated scheme, but to a Swiss company. And Montenegro is very rich in aluminum ore, and it makes the first step in the purification of aluminum is done there. And that's the most labor-intensive and energy-consuming step of the entire aluminum processing industry. And the later steps for further purification and then production of secondary products from aluminum, like aluminum foil and, I don't know, handles and little items from aluminum, is the most profitable and the least labor-intensive. And so you would think that one would want to stimulate that sort of business activity. And in fact, this production plant in the old times did produce such goods, and it has the capacity to produce such goods. But Glencore, the company under whose management it was, didn't allow it to produce these goods because it didn't want it to compete with its own markets that it had in other areas. So it was, even though the capacity was there and the people wanted to make these products and they could extract a considerable amount of profit from it, they weren't allowed because it didn't conform to the interests of Glencore, which is, of course, again, conflicting with the interests of Montenegrin people. I want to just wrap up this talk about economic policy with an observation. When Germans were making plans for the Balkans in the 20s and in the 30s, they developed a concept, and I really like the word because it sums up everything that I've been talking about. And they called this region Ergänzungswirtschaftsraum, so it's supplementary economic space. And what's going on today is just sort of a replay of that history. And this was before the Germany became fascist, of course. A lot of these plans became implemented when Germany was turned to Nazism, but it doesn't have much to do with fascism. It's just geopolitics of a certain kind. And when you have this kind of a conceptual scheme, and the whole policy is determined by the kind of thinking that goes on in Ergänzungswirtschaftsraum, you can't expect that the Balkans, and Montenegro specifically, but it applies to the entire Balkans, can develop economically, and that being a prerequisite for any kind of peaceful existence in the future.
Alex Dajkovic geht in der Folge auf die montenegrinische Medienlandschaft ein, deren Diskurs sich vor allem auf die nationale Frage beschränke.
As I said, in the last 10 years, the Balkans are returning to a service zone which is exporting raw resources, raw materials to the West at very cheap prices. It's also a zone where Western companies can come in and have very cheap labor. I mean, at $100 per month average salary is, I mean, that's really one of the cheapest in Europe. And in the world, compared to world scales, it's also very cheap. And it also serves to absorb Western surplus capital from the West. And all of these things have nothing to do with the Montenegrin population, and they benefit the Montenegrin population very little. Or in fact, the benefit the Montenegrin population extracts from this is only incidental. It's only an accident because it's not part of the plan. The plan is that the Western centers of power get benefits from this kind of a policy arrangement. There's also, in part of the whole transition process and restructuring has a social dimension in addition to the economic dimension. And I want to just give you a couple of examples from that because it complements the economic changes that are going on. And one of the things that was passed was a law on non-governmental organizations. Society changed from socialism to what we have now, which is wild 18th century, 19th century capitalism. The way of organizing the society, social activities, has also changed. And now, where there used to be state-financed cultural groups and and local groups and so on, that doesn't exist anymore. And now the way to organize in the civil society is through non-governmental organizations. And the law that was written also by USAID is very interesting because it allows the government to refuse registration of a non-governmental organization. I mean, I don't know if that exists in any other democratic country, but the government can simply say, we don't like your constitution, we don't like your charter, and we refuse registration. And that was actually used to refuse registration of a non-governmental organization that wasn't that didn't conform to the interests of the current government. There's now also happening, the law on pensions is being reformed, and I've had the privilege of talking to a World Bank economist that's working on this. I went to dinner with her just before I came here, and I was asking her, well, I said, what's wrong with the current pension law? The only problem is that people's pensions are not high, but I mean, everybody pays into a fund throughout their life, and everybody at the end of their working life gets money out. And it's worked wonderfully for the last 50 years. What's wrong with it? Well, she said, there's no money for this kind of system. People have to save their own money, and the state can't afford to pay for this. Well, I said, but the state afforded to pay for this for 50 years after World War II. Well, yes, she said, but the GDP was more than twice as high back then. So it's really interesting, the logic she's right. She's absolutely correct. But the interesting thing is that she has come here to work to reform the law on pensions. She didn't come here to increase the GDP. And most of the technical assistance people that come to reform all of these various laws and don't come to develop economic policies that are actually going to lead to some kind of economic growth and development. There's just recently a law on work, a labor law, in fact, was discussed in the parliament, and again, the old laws were very socialist. They come from the socialist era, and they gave a lot of rights to the workers, to the unions. They had a say in the management of the company and so on. But the new law is basically rewriting. It's basically copied from American labor laws with a lot less provisions for the workers, and there has been some protest against this, but is very inefficient because the pressures to pass this law are very high from the American and mainly American ambassador and envoys and people who come to exert pressure on the Montenegrin government. There's also, right now, the World Bank is working on reforming the healthcare system. Old Yugoslavia was excellent. The reason, first of all, everybody was covered for healthcare. All regions, even remote rural regions, had so-called health centers where people can go and get primary health care. And that's, for example, in the United States, I know that that's really a big problem to get, because it's a market-regulated system. There's no incentives for doctors to go to rural areas because they don't make a lot of money. So there's a lot of large areas of the United States where they don't have doctors because nobody goes there. But in the old system, these were built by the state, and so even the remote areas were able to get healthcare provision, basic healthcare provisions.
Nach dem Referat Alex Dajkovics kam es noch zu einer längeren Diskussion, in der es anfangs um die Beteiligung Deutschlands und Österreichs an der Zerschlagung und ökonomischen Kolonialisierung Jugoslawiens ging. In der ersten Frage wurde ausdrücklich darauf verwiesen, dass es vor der Einführung des Euros ja die deutsche Mark war, die in Montenegro zum Zahlungsmittel wurde und dass nun deutsche Euros das Münzgeld in der kleinen Republik darstellten. Der Referent gab dabei dem Fragesteller recht, dass die Rolle Deutschlands und Österreichs beim Prozess der Desintegration Jugoslawiens keinesfalls zu unterschätzen wäre. Der stärkere Fokus seines Referats auf die USA liege daran, dass er seit Ausbruch des Krieges in der USA studiere und sich deshalb persönlich intensiver mit der Rolle der Vereinigten Staaten auseinandergesetzt habe. Deutschland habe jedoch sowohl über Geheimdienstkontakte zu kroatischen und albanischen Nationalisten als auch durch die wirtschaftliche Einflussnahme in der Region eine ebenso wichtige Rolle gespielt. Eine weitere Frage betraf die Rolle und den Einfluss von NGOs in der montenegrinischen Gesellschaft, die vielfach von der Soros-Stiftung unterstützt werden. Alex Dajkovic sieht in Montenegro einen vergleichsweise geringen Entwicklungsgrad solcher Organisationen, was auch am Mangel eines großen urbanen Zentrums liege. Immerhin besitzt Montenegros Hauptstadt Podgorica nicht mehr Einwohner als eine österreichische Bundesländerhauptstadt. Die koloniale Umklammerung der Region sieht er jedenfalls mit oder ohne einer möglichen Unabhängigkeit Montenegros nur sehr schwer auflösbar, da der Balkan wieder einmal als Ergänzungswirtschaftsraum für die westeuropäischen Industriestaaten interessant geworden ist.
interessante Zeitschrift mit kritischen Beiträgen zu Ost- und Südosteuropa sind die Ost-West-Gegeninformationen, bestellbar bei Ost-West-Gegeninformationen, Mozartgasse 3, 8010 Graz. Ost-West-Gegeninformationen, Mozartgasse 3, 8010 Graz. Im Web sind sie erreichbar unter www.kfunigrads.at/ost-west/www.gvi.kf-unigrads.at/ost-west/.
Diese Sendung wurde von der Ökologischen Linken Wien produziert. Texte der ÖKOLI finden Sie im Internet unter www.oekoli.cjb.net. Die Musik der Sendung stammt von Stian Carstensens Farmers Market.
Ein Probeabo der Zeitschrift Kontext 21, die nächsten 3 Ausgaben kostenlos, unverbindlich und ohne automatische Verlängerung, kann an folgender Adresse bestellt werden: Kontext 21, Schottengasse 3a-1-4-59 A1010 Wien. Die Internetausgabe befindet sich an der Adresse http://kontext21.mediaweb.at. Es ist jeweils die lateinische Schreibweise zu beachten, also Kontext mit C und 21 als XXI.